So if an engineer finds like a microfracture in a steel beam on a suspension bridge, they don't just sit around debating the philosophical nature of the fracture.
Right. No, they measure the load capacity.
Exactly. So they
Yeah.
run a stress test. I mean, the diagnostic tools are universal and the metrics are absolute.
Yeah, everybody agrees on the math.
Right. But when you pivot to the architecture of global security, and specifically the mechanics of modern terrorism, those universal diagnostic tools just, well, they vanish,
They do. The precision equipment is fundamentally broken.
which is wild. And that's what we're unpacking today for you on this deep dive, the anatomy, the evolution, and the organizational structure of modern terrorism.
Because we crave that binary clarity, right? Like we want threats to be visible and neatly categorized.
Yeah, but the reality is entirely murky. And I want to start by throwing this out to you, the listener. Have you ever noticed how hard it is to pin down exactly what terrorism actually is?
It's incredibly difficult.
Legally speaking, you would assume the global community has, a single ironclad definition for a threat of this magnitude.
You would assume that, yeah, but there is absolutely no universal consensus.
None at all.
And that lack of alignment, I mean, it isn't just an academic problem, it's a massive operational vulnerability.
I mean, take the UN, right?
Yeah.
After September 11th, they drafted this working definition, but it's just incredibly bulky.
Right. It tries to do way too much.
Exactly. It attempts to swallow every possible scenario while simultaneously trying to limit the definition strictly to political motives and civilian targets.
Which immediately creates these massive legal loopholes. Because if an armed group targets, say, a military barracks specifically to break the morale of a nation,
Instead of hitting a cafe or something.
yeah, instead of a civilian cafe, some legal frameworks suddenly don't classify that as a terrorist act. It just becomes a different category of conflict.
Wow. And it gets even more bizarre when you look inside a single government. Because I found this absolutely mind-blowing. The U.S. government does not have a unified internal definition.
No, they don't.
The FBI, the Department of Defense, the State Department, they all operate under entirely different legal definitions.
It sounds chaotic, but when you look closer, you realize why. They're basically solving for entirely different variables based on their specific bureaucratic mandates.
Right, so let's break down that bureaucratic friction. Like the Department of Defense, they're in the business of warfare, right?
Yeah, national defense. So their definition heavily emphasizes the threat of force used to coerce entire societies or governments.
But meanwhile, you have the FBI, which is a domestic law enforcement agency.
Right. Their mandate is investigating crimes and getting convictions in a courtroom.
Exactly. So their definition revolves around the unlawful use of force against persons or property. They're looking at the tangible criminal acts like explosives, property damage, because, well, that's what they can actually prosecute.
And then you have the State Department, right, handling diplomacy. Their definition narrows in on politically motivated violence against non-combatants by subnational groups.
Because they're looking at the geopolitical fallout.
Precisely. They can't agree because they're viewing the exact same phenomenon through completely different operational lenses.
Trying to legally define it is, honestly, it's like trying to nail jelly to a wall. But then you contrast that bureaucratic mess with a country like Colombia.
Right, who have decades of brutal experience dealing with internal conflict.
Yeah. In their penal code, it's Article 343, they define it simply around acts that create a state of anxiety or terror in the population to endanger life or infrastructure.
It's entirely pragmatic. I mean, Colombia's definition largely ignores the political motivation, the why, and focuses strictly on the what.
If you blow up an electrical grid to terrify a city, it just doesn't matter if your manifesto is Marxist or fascist or religious.
Right. The act itself is the defining metric.
Okay, so let's unpack this. If global superpowers can't even agree on a basic legal diagnostic tool, how on earth do we go about dismantling it?
Well, you have to stop looking at the legal semantics and start looking at the mechanical objectives.
Okay.
To understand how to dismantle these networks, you have to track their evolution. You have to look at how they mutated from, localized grievances into stateless global franchises.
So let's trace that dividing line. There's a massive operational gap between local or regional terrorism and global terrorism.
Huge gap. Regional groups are essentially tied to a zip code.
They're geographically contained.
Exactly. Local terrorism is usually driven by specific political goals or ethno-nationalism. And crucially, those goals are sometimes negotiable, at least in theory.
Like the FARC in Colombia, whose historical objective was to violently overthrow the government for a Marxist-Leninist state. or the IRA in Ireland, or ETA in Spain.
Right. The violence is horrific, but it's applied to a highly specific territory to achieve a localized political outcome.
And the sources point out you see this regional constraint even in incredibly complex hotspots, like Hamas, who have been the governing authority in Gaza since 2006.
Yeah, and if you look at their 1988 charter, it explicitly rejected peaceful solutions in favor of armed resistance against Israel.
But from an organizational standpoint, their actions, their recruitment, their objectives, they're all hyper-localized to that specific territory.
Right. They aren't attempting to overthrow the government of France or Japan.
But then we cross the line into global terrorism, and this is where geographic boundaries just completely vanish.
The goals become non-negotiable.
Yeah, the objective shifts from capturing territory to inflicting massive psychological impact on a worldwide scale.
And al-Qaeda is really the architectural blueprint for this. I mean, to understand global terrorism, you have to understand the year 1989.
Following the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Exactly. There was this massive convergence of fighters in Pakistan. Thousands of men from all over the Muslim world who had just successfully fought off a superpower.
They were highly energized, heavily armed, and they were coalescing around a new leadership structure headed by Osama bin Laden.
And they developed a cohesive ideology centered on removing Western influence from their home countries. Plus, they had the operational capacity to strike globally.
Which eventually leads us to the ultimate pivot point, right? September 11, 2001.
Yeah.
And 9/11 is fascinating from a purely mechanical perspective because it was the ultimate symbolic attack. I mean, al-Qaeda wasn't trying to capture a physical territory in Manhattan.
No, the objective was purely psychological. It was designed to humiliate the United States and basically broadcast the vulnerability of an untouchable superpower.
To build a wall of hate between the West and the Muslim world.
Exactly.
But here's my question, or pushback, really. If 9/11 was their twisted version of a success, didn't it actually backfire organizationally?
What do you mean?
Well, prior to 9/11, they had a highly centralized hierarchy. Safe havens, training camps in Afghanistan, finance committees. But the U.S. military response obliterated that infrastructure. It forced them to scatter.
That's true.
So by pulling off their biggest attack, they effectively destroyed their own operational headquarters. It sounds like the crackdown forced them to decentralize into a franchise model, like a fast food chain, just to survive.
That's an incredibly accurate way to visualize it. They traded physical sanctuary for ideological reach. You're highlighting the exact moment the threat mutated.
Right.
Because the global intelligence crackdown made it impossible to operate in the open. They couldn't run a top-down hierarchy anymore, so they spawned regional franchises.
So you suddenly had AQIM al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and AQAP in the Arabian Peninsula.
Yeah. Corporate provides the brand name, the ideology, the recipe. But the local branch managers have to source their own ingredients and run daily operations.
Which means running one of these regional franchises requires like an intense level of administrative competence. You don't just pull off a localized terror network by accident.
No, definitely not.
And this is where we get into the corporate mechanics. There's this sociological framework from the 70s resource mobilization theory by McCarthy and Zold.
It completely shatters the illusion that terrorist groups are just chaotic, irrational mobs.
Right. McCarthy and Zold basically proved these organizations operate with ruthless corporate efficiency. They need 5 specific categories of resources to keep the machinery running.
Yes, the supply chain of fear.
Let's break that down. The first one is material resources, the tangible capital. Money, weapons, technology, safe houses.
And the scale of this material wealth, I mean, it can be staggering. Take ISIS at the peak of its territorial control. They physically captured oil fields in Syria.
Which is wild, because extracting oil isn't something a mob can do. You need petroleum engineers. You need refining capacity.
You need a black market supply chain with trucks to move the product?
Right, and a financial apparatus to launder the cash. I read that at one point, ISIS was pulling in up to $1 million a day from a single Syrian oil well.
$1 million a day?
$1 million. Running alongside traditional mafia-style extortion and robbery.
It's a massive illicit corporate conglomerate. But, you know, money alone doesn't sustain a movement. You also need moral resources.
Which is what?
The solidarity and social support a group can extract from a sympathetic or, honestly, deeply intimidated population.
So if you have moral support in a region, you have sanctuary. The locals won't turn you in.
Exactly. Sometimes it's extracted through terror, but often they earn it by providing essential social services or security in areas where the legitimate government has completely failed.
Wow, okay, and that moral sanctuary is structured by the third pillar, social organizational resources.
Going back to that corporate hierarchy, even in a decentralized franchise, you have a clear division of labor: quartermasters, propagandists, bomb makers.
Everyone has a specific job and formal codes of conduct, which brings us to the fourth and, honestly, arguably most critical resource, human capital.
Yes. You need leaders to plan, volunteers to assist, and foot soldiers to execute.
But how they manage HR is just wild to think about. Wait, listening to this list. Human resources, organizational hierarchy. It sounds exactly like the business plan for a Silicon Valley startup, just engineered for a horrific end product.
They're managing a supply chain, but yeah, instead of software, it's fear.
And a legit startup recruits talent by offering, like, stock options and a 401k. A terror cell recruits by offering psychological equity.
They target marginalized, alienated individuals and compensate them with a profound sense of belonging and elevated social status.
They aren't paying in cash, they're paying in purpose.
And that purpose is reinforced by the fifth pillar: cultural resources. This is the ideological know-how, the doctrines that justify the violence.
Plus the literal practical knowledge, the shared PDFs on how to bypass security or build devices. It's the institutional memory of the group.
Exactly. But, and this is key, having all five of those resources sitting in a room doesn't automatically generate an attack.
Right, the powder keg needs a spark.
Yeah, and this is where sociologist Neil Smelser's value-added theory comes into play. He identified that underlying structural tension like poverty or political disenfranchisement, that's just the baseline condition.
It's necessary but not sufficient.
Right. For collective violence to actually ignite, you need a precipitating incident.
A detonator.
A detonator.
Yeah.
It could be an abuse by police, an offensive policy, a military stripe, something that serves as undeniable proof to the recruits that their grievances are real and action is required right now.
But Smelser points out one final crucial ingredient, right? A failure of societal control.
Yes, the authorities have to mismanage that precipitating incident. If the government fails to address the detonator effectively, the tension flashes over into kinetic violence.
It's fascinating. You can trace any major event back through this exact supply chain: the material funding, the structure, and the specific precipitating incident.
So if human capital is their most vital asset, we have to look at how they organize these people today. The structure is often described as concentric circles of support.
Okay, visualize a target. Dead center in the bullseye is the core organization. The C-suite, the leaders, the highly trained operatives.
Then moving one ring out, you have the collaborators, the independent contractors. They might not pull a trigger, but they forge passports, rent safe houses, move the money.
The logistics team. And the third ring is the sympathizers, like radicalized brand ambassadors. They agree with the ideology, they spread propaganda, but they aren't taking direct orders.
And the outermost ring is the general reference community, the broad demographic the organization falsely claims to represent, which is their primary target market for future recruitment.
And historically, moving someone from that outer ring all the way to the core required physical proximity, right?
Yeah, a recruiter had to sit down with someone in a community center or a prison.
But the internet just completely vaporized those geographic limitations. They weaponized the web.
The digital era allowed these franchises to reach directly into the outer rings with zero physical friction.
And the terrifying case study for this is Anwar al-Awlaki,
Yeah.
a U.S.-born cleric for al-Qaeda, who completely revolutionized their HR department. He realized he didn't need to smuggle operatives into Western cities.
He utilized YouTube, social media, digital magazines.
Producing highly polished English-language content explicitly designed to radicalize Westerners right in their own living rooms.
He engineered what we now call the lone wolf. He created a system where an individual could have absolutely no physical contact with the core organization.
Never receive a wire transfer or a forged passport.
But they consume so much of that digital cultural resource that they self-radicalize. They supply their own material resources, and they act entirely on their own.
It's the ultimate optimization of the franchise model. The core just broadcasts the ideology and waits for an isolated individual to act.
Which brings us to the psychological goal of all of this. A social psychologist named Uri Kruglansky coined a brilliant term for it: minority social influence.
I want to break this down because it flips traditional sociology completely on its head. Usually, the vast majority dictates the norms and behaviors of the minority.
Right, but terrorism attempts the exact reverse. The entire objective is for a statistically microscopic, highly active minority to alter the behavior and the daily lives of the vast majority.
And they do it through the continuous application of fear. You don't have to defeat a nation's military to change the nation.
No, by utilizing extreme violence, a tiny group forces a society to spend trillions on security infrastructure.
They force the majority to change how they travel, how they vote, how they police their own citizens.
It's a strategy of psychological exhaustion. The tail violently wags the dog.
Which exposes a really bizarre, almost hypocritical paradox. These global extremists openly despise Western culture and institutions, right?
Yes, completely.
Yet they are perfectly happy to weaponize Western technology, our social media algorithms, our video platforms, to achieve their goals.
Well, they don't view it as a paradox at all. To them, Western technology is completely stripped of its cultural context. It's simply another material resource to be exploited.
Ah, I see.
And that highlights why this remains such a persistent, mutating threat. They are highly adaptable learning organizations. If a new tool emerges that allows them to mobilize resources more efficiently, they just integrate it immediately.
Wow. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I mean, we've covered a tremendous amount of ground on this deep dive.
We really have.
We started with how universal diagnostic tools fail with terrorism, with governments constantly clashing over basic legal definitions.
We traced the evolution from localized groups with negotiable grievances into global decentralized franchises.
We looked at the corporate efficiency required to run those franchises, the supply chain of fear, the mobilization of illicit wealth, moral sanctuary, and the sophisticated HR apparatus.
And the takeaway here is really a new analytical framework. The next time you see a news report about a tragic event, you don't have to be blinded by just the raw emotion.
Right. You can look past that and understand the underlying machinery at work. You can ask yourself, what resources is this group mobilizing?
What specific precipitating incident did they use to detonate the structural tension?
And what specific minority social influence are they trying to exert over the rest of us? When you map out the mechanics, it ceases to be senseless, unpredictable chaos.
Exactly. It's highly calculated. And because it operates on a logistical framework, that framework can be analyzed, intercepted, and ultimately dismantled.
But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to ponder, something that builds on how these groups adapt. We established that modern terror franchises rely heavily on cultural resources, ideological know-how, and digital HR recruitment via social media.
Right, like Anwar al-Awlaki on YouTube.
A human cleric broadcasting to a broad audience. But what happens when these decentralized franchises plug into artificial intelligence?
Oh, wow. You move from mass-produced propaganda to hyper-personalized radicalization.
Imagine an automated synthetic radicalization loop. An AI that doesn't just broadcast a generic video, but actively scrapes a vulnerable person's digital footprint.
It analyzes their search history, their frustrations.
It identifies the exact precipitating incidents that trigger their personal anger and generates custom-tailored, photorealistic propaganda specifically for an audience of one.
Could the next evolution of the lone wolf be entirely manufactured by an algorithm that knows exactly which psychological buttons to push?
It would be the terrifying culmination of resource mobilization theory. The precision diagnostic equipment of the future might not be in the hands of the engineers trying to fix the bridge. It might be entirely in the hands of the algorithms trying to bring it down.
Definitely something to mull over.
Until next time, keep diving deep.